Welcome again to the second annual Bay Area Book Festival. I was on the founding team of the festival, and I just want to tell you that it is so exciting to see this many people here who love books and celebrating our favorite authors. And I encourage you to get even more involved next year and maybe volunteer or look for some kind of sponsorship opportunity and all of that stuff. As I'm sure you know, and are here because Dan Clowes, and that is the correct pronunciation, is one of the most celebrated graphic novelists in history and in the world right now. And we're now lucky enough to be looking back at 3 decades of extraordinary, groundbreaking, innovative, incredibly funny, incredibly deep work that he's done. And I'm really excited to be talking to him about that. And the session goes until 2:45, so at 2:20 we'll do some questions, and then I do hope that you will join us for the signing over at Green Apple Books. My name is Ivory Madison. I'm, among other things, the author of a much less celebrated graphic novel called Huntress Year One for DC Comics, and I run a small publishing house called Astor and Lenox.
Did you write it or did you draw it also?
That's so funny that you ask, because that's what everybody asks me. I only wrote it. And so this is actually one of my questions was, so people always ask me that, did you draw it? And I say, no, of course not. Typically.
Why would I do that?
Why would I do that? That's hard work.
Waste of my life.
That takes talent. So with a book like mine, which is much more typical and much more of what you see at the bookstore, you have someone who's a writer, and there's an editor, and there's a penciler, and there's an inker, and there's a colorist, and there's a letterer, and there's an art department, there's a cover designer, there's all these people involved. And Dan, you do all of that yourself. You do 7 to 10 jobs all by yourself. He does all of that on his books. And I wanted to ask...
They don't pay me extra either.
Right.
You know, if they hired a cover designer for these books, they'd have to pay them extra. Yes. And I one day realized, wait a minute, I'm just doing this free work. You know, once when I was in high school, I was figuring out that if you did writing, you know, which starts with W, art, inking, and lettering, that you would be wailing on a comic. So I wanted to try to market that phrase when I was like 15. I'm going to wail on some comic.
But it turns out you were and still are one of the only people doing that. I mean, who is successful.
I don't know if that's true.
Well, tell me a short list of all the people who really do it all, because I was trying to do some research, and I am familiar with the area, and I could only come up with a tiny handful.
Well, pretty much anybody who's done an acclaimed graphic novel in sort of my end of the world. Art Spiegelman did everything on Mouse. Alison Bechdel on all her books. Right. Robert Crumb has never, I guess he collaborates with his wife sometimes, but his work is entirely his own. Chris Ware, Adrian Tomina, both of the Hernandez brothers for the most part.
But we are talking...
Chester Brown.
Yeah, but we are talking about a handful
of weirdos.
I think it's important for people to understand that there's a very small number of people who can do all of those jobs and who have the judgment to... I mean, like, you don't let anybody see this until it's completely done, right? No, and I would count that as a psychological defect, really. I mean, I'm very, very attuned to anybody's reaction, and so I don't want the book to be affected by the fact that one of my friends is in a slightly bad mood, or that he's just not getting what I'm doing, or that my wife wants me to do something else and not what, So I learned many years ago that, like, I would let my wife read the stories as I was working on them sometimes. And she was always very nice and sort of neutral. And
she would just say like, well, this one panel, I don't know. She's just trying to find something to say. I think to make it seem like I'm not just, trying to be nice. I really have a comment. But of course I would obsess over that little thing that she picked on and try to reconfigure the entire story. So, and then later she go, I was just saying that. I was just trying to like not sound like I was not paying attention. And I realized I need to be in a vacuum doing these stories. And I love that, you finish a book and it's sink or swim. It's all, you can't hide, You can't say like, well, it's because the cover artist screwed up or the letterer messed up.
Right.
It's all, it's all there. You have to make every decision.
And it's all, your DNA is in everything.
Yeah.
From the fonts to the color
Well, and I
saturation.
try to do lettering and things that look machine made, but everything's just drawn by hand.
Mm-hmm. So I was, I already knew a lot about you, but I was doing research online, and I found this site called House of Names that does family crests, and so this is the Clowes family.
My poor grandma once sent a lot of money to one of those,
no.
like where it was like your family history, and I was like, this is complete bull.
Well, yours has 3 floating unicorn heads on it, which I think.
Oh well, that's the actual crest.
Pretty cool. Yeah, that's and you can get a keychain and a mug if you want.
I want that.
But what I was thinking was you should do a piece of your reinterpretation of the crest.
It could never top this.
There's a little green lion with a weapon on your head. I
know the actual Clowes family crest would be like a bunch of farmers sleeping in a ditch by the side of the road.
Well, I think you should do one. I would like to see that. I also, in my research, tried to come up with good interview questions. And if you try to, so I Googled, good interview questions.
Really? Just generic good interview?
And it turns out nobody's interviewing cartoonists. They're interviewing people for jobs. So I found some questions. So it's always like, these are the questions that you should ask.
To test my integrity.
Yes. So I have a couple of questions that I got from the job interview.
This will explain why I've never had a job.
Have you ever stolen a pen from work?
I don't think it's possible.
Well, you're not going to get hired at Jiffy Software, but I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's not possible. Pick 2 celebrities to be your parents. This was for a sales associate job at Urban Outfitters.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What's the correct answer to that?
Oh.
Like Barack and Michelle Obama. I mean, what do they want you to say?
I don't know. I was wondering, like, did they mean 2 celebrities you wish were your parents, or 2 celebrities that obviously, if they had married, you would be their child?
My dad looked a lot like San Francisco legend Rod McEwen, the famous singer, songwriter, poet, to the extent that we'd be out in a restaurant sometimes and like a young girl would come up and go, Mr. McEwen, can I have your autograph? And my dad had been a classics major at the University of Chicago and memorized, vast wealth of poetry, and was just so deeply offended to be compared to Rod McEwen, who was... I don't even know if there's no corollary today. There's no like populist poet that I know of.
No.
That would be, that wrote, we had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun.
Yeah. What about mom? Who would be your celebrity
My
mom?
is uncategorizable. There's nobody like my mom ran after she divorced my dad when I was 1.5, she ran a garage on the south side of Chicago fixing foreign cars, and then became a jiu-jitsu black belt. She's an NRA nut who is a expert marksman, and she went to law school when she was 75 and got her law degree, and now practices elder law. So I can't. There's no way.
There's no celebrity who could compare to that. I think you're right.
Yeah.
I also, I wanted to see other interviews with you. And so when I would look them up on YouTube, you know how they match, they're looking at the metadata and they're preloading other videos that they think you're going to watch next.
Right.
And so they kept loading Amy Schumer videos.
Really?
Yeah. And so I was wondering, what metadata could you possibly, or demographic?
Here's my guess, is that there's a hall at the University of Indiana where a lot of celebrities appear, Clowes Hall. They pronounce it Clowes. She probably appeared there, had a big concert, and that's what it is.
That could be. It could also be cringeworthy sex.
It could be. I like Amy Schumer.
Yeah, me too. Okay, yeah, I was wondering about that one.
But yeah, that's a leap.
Yeah. I like Amy Schumer too, but
but that's weird to go directly from me to her.
Because I was just sort of sitting there, and then it loaded one called Third Date, in which she's on a date with a man who reveals that he has AIDS, and she says that's not a problem, but then she says she doesn't eat gluten, and then he walks out on her.
Wish I could take credit for that.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, earlier this year, there's this big award in France, this Lifetime Achievement Award by this comics organization, conference in France, and my French is really bad. I'm not even going to try.
Mine too.
Yeah, okay, good. So we won't even try to pronounce it.
Oh, it's Angoulême is how it's pronounced.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Okay, the Grand Prix d'Angoulême, and this is a Lifetime Achievement Award, and they created a short list of 30 cartoonists who are, the most accomplished in the world. And there were no women on the list, and you boycotted it and asked that your name be withdrawn from consideration, and you had very strong words for them, and a lot of other artists followed suit.
I don't want to take so much credit for leading the way on that, because it was really, I had no idea that I was nominated for this award. I don't care about anything like that, and I'm actively don't want to know about stuff like that because it's distracting. And so that morning somebody emailed me and said, this is what happened. Would you consider withdrawing your name? And I just immediately wrote back and said, yeah, that's ridiculous. I don't want to be part of that. And I was the only one who checked my email that morning. So I was like 24 hours ahead of all people like Chris Ware and Charles Burns later did the same thing, but they were just, living their actual lives and not checking their email at 8 a.m. And so it looked as though I was the only one who had the courage to take that stand. Right. And I wouldn't want that to go against all the other people who did later come out and have that. But it's funny because I had an interview that day next day with someone from the Netherlands, I think, and I just mentioned that whole thing to them, and what do you think of that? And they said, that's just the French. They're like, of course the French would do that.
But in this same vein, I feel like that's not unrelated to you, of course. It shouldn't be a big deal that you would say, of course, I don't want to participate in that.
The thing that really got me is that my favorite French cartoonist is this woman named Nicole Clavelou, who I've loved her work since I was a teenager. And I've never seen her mentioned in any of these discussions. And she's like just this incredible, amazing artist who I think just gave up because nobody was interested in her work. And I looked at the history of the award and I saw that she had never been anywhere near the nomination of that. And I just thought, that's stupid. Because a lot of the people on the list, myself included, I thought, they don't deserve that award.
Well, I think
Stan Lee was on the
list. Sorry. Anyway, okay, I'm going to move on.
He only writes comics.
But unrelated, or not unrelated to that, though, to me, in my mind, is when you wrote Ghost World, a lot of people said, how are you able to write realistic female characters? And I think you made some comments of like, well, you had seen a lot of people not writing realistic female characters. In other words, it doesn't seem to be a stretch for you to just understand,
Well, I don't know. anything beyond those characters. I just felt like I knew people like those two girls. Like a lot of people that had that kind of dynamic and those personalities, and it just felt natural to do that.
And well, because Joss Whedon, are you a Joss? Do you like? Well, I'm not going to ask that. Are you? So Joss Whedon, the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, he was always being asked, "Why do you write strong female characters?" And he would say, "Why don't you ask 100 other guys why they're not?" And I feel like when people were saying to you, "Wow, how do you write realistic female characters?" that, it should be more like, "Why don't you go ask 100 other guys why they're not writing realistic female characters?" But anyway. Let's see. Okay. So we have to talk about superheroes. I'm so sorry.
We do?
I'm so sorry.
Why do we?
I really enjoyed your work, Death Ray and Black Nylon, of course, because I enjoy your work and I also enjoy superhero work. And what I was wondering, and I think I know what the answer is, but if I know you have a lot of disdain both for the business side and also for a lot of the low-quality work that comes out of the whole genre. But I was wondering, if Marvel or DC said you can do absolutely anything you want to do and do it your way, you can write Superman or Captain America and do it completely your way, would you have any interest in doing that?
No, but but years ago, they would, every 5 or 6 years, both of those companies would decide, we're going to get some new blood in here, and they would come to people like me, including me, and say, you can do whatever you want, take any of our characters, just invent a whole new story, do a whole new thing. And I would always say, the only character I'm really interested in is Superman, because I think you could do something really interesting with this horrific alien from another planet who feels the need to beat up Earthlings and who has incredibly deep psychological problems.
Yeah.
I thought that's really fascinating. He's a horrific monster, really. And they would always go, "Oh, we thought you were gonna pick, Batmite or some character that nobody cares about. That you'll just do some funny little." And it was like, no, I could do that in my own comic. It's like only if I had the iconography of Superman would it ever be interesting. But I don't like the way they treat people at those companies. I don't like. I would never ever do anything that I didn't own. I own everything that I've ever done, and I'm not going to do slave labor for corporate products that I don't own like that. I just think it's wrong.
And speaking of which, an artist friend of mine who does work for them, who agrees with you, it hasn't been my experience.
A lot of artists.
Yeah, of course.
That's...
So validating that, he wanted me to ask you how he gets out of what he has experienced as this horrible...
It's too late, he's enslaved already. He's doomed.
Well, that was...
Yeah, no, I don't know how. I don't know.
Okay. No, that's fair. He doesn't know how either. So,
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
There's a lot of great artists who get, spent their lives doing that stuff. And, you think, what was the alternative? What could they have done? A lot of them find a way to make something interesting out of that experience. But for me, I'd just feel so constricted.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I'm sorry to bring up TV again, but Larry David, the co-creator of Seinfeld, said that he had a rule, or purportedly had a rule on the show, at the end, no hugging, no learning.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I really, in rereading some of your work recently, and in reading the new work, I was thinking it's almost like there was a no hugging, no learning rule in some of your earlier work, like the Blue Italian job. That's not what it's really called, but moderators were asked not to use profanity.
There's so many kids in here.
Right. But
I'm one of the younger people in here. That's a sad
So it seems like there was a lot more missed opportunities and more anti-hero kind of stories. And I felt in Patience, which I loved, that sort of the young man of the earlier stories got to become a hero, got to be a real bona fide hero. That was my interpretation. Do you feel that way, that perhaps this is what some of the earlier characters that you've written hoped they would be capable of?
No, not really.
Okay.
But I know what you're talking about. I mean, certainly this story, I put more weight on everything coming together in a certain way at the end. That you have a interpretation that some people have the opposite of that. People are all over the map, and my intent was for that to be the case. That I wasn't clear. I didn't know what the ending was going to be exactly. I knew the sort of the matrix of events that would lead to that last few pages, but I had no idea what the actual, events of those pages were going to be in terms of like who was going to be the last man standing and all that. And I had to write it as I was living it, in a way, as I was drawing it. And when I got to that ending, it felt absolutely right and natural. But I hadn't ever thought of it in terms of what did I feel was, the message that's being imparted or anything like that. It's just the inevitable ending, right. And I don't know what I'm saying. I'm never trying to say something. They're certainly never. They're not intended as propaganda in any way.
Right.
Expounding on my worldview.
Right. No, I didn't think that you were. I just wondered if after you wrote it, you sort of looked at that guy and were proud of him for being so tough. And
there's that interpretation, but then there's also that he may have caused everything that happened to him, and that and that he's not necessarily not thinking in terms of the community around him. He's sort of single focused on one focused element of his own life.
Yes, I did notice that.
So it's debatable as to whether he's a good or bad character.
Right. Well, and so do you have an opinion? Because you're saying everyone. What's your opinion?
Well, I try to feel a connection to all the characters, and I try to feel. I try to start out a story not necessarily connecting to the characters, to feel that they may be off-putting or characters that I would like, just sort of from my first impression. And then over the course of the story, I try to find a way to love and know the characters and let them be who they are. And so I felt a connection to the guy, but I'm not sure I would condone his behavior.
Well, and you raise a good point, is that when someone, all they care about is their wife and child, they're not really putting the needs or the benefit of the larger community or the other characters.
Yeah, I don't know if that's heroic or not.
Right.
But it's something I can certainly relate to.
Yeah. Okay. Want to make sure that Okay, so speaking of corporate overlords, I was wondering about your episode with OK Soda. Can you?
Yeah, that was the ultimate.
Does anyone here remember OK Soda?
It was never in the Bay Area.
Right. So
it was a product that the Coca-Cola Corporation did in 1991, 2.
I don't know. I looked it up on Wikipedia, but now I didn't.
No, it must have been 92 because it was right when I moved to California, where they were trying to sell a soft drink to Generation X, to sort of the disaffected, I don't care crowd, and they tried to do it in this really interesting way, which was just to make it like, this is a bland, boring soft drink, nothing matters, and it's just okay.
Yeah.
And they got this brilliant art director, this guy who only did really strange, odd campaigns. They gave him full reins to do this thing, and it was this ad agency in Portland, Wyden and Kennedy, that made Michael Jordan and Nike famous, and they one day, just out of the blue, I get this FedEx package with a mock-up where it had one of my faces, just a guy staring forward, and it just says okay. And they were like, can you sort of draw a version of this? And we're going to put it on a Coke can. And in the same package, I could see the other artists they were going to get. One of them was Charles Burns, who was a sort of a friend of mine, and now a very good friend. But back then, I didn't know him that well. But I got his number, and I called him up, and we were like, what do you think of it? And we were both like, had done enough illustration to know that this would never, ever see the light of day. We're like, this is so obviously a horrendous idea. And so I was like, yeah, it's the easiest thing I'll ever have to do is draw a face. So I was like, okay, we'll do it. And then the next thing I know, it's like, yeah, we made the cans. It's going to be like marketed in all these kind of hipster college towns. It was in Portland, Seattle, Austin, and so it came out. It was on the shelves. They had TV ads, all this kind of stuff, and it was the most enormous flop in Coca-Cola history. They lost millions of dollars for Coca-Cola, and I was sort of like, but why didn't you just ask me? I could have told.
Right.
I always wondered, like, did they think my comics sold at all? Did they were they like, oh, we'll get his built-in audience of millions? But it was really a remarkable idea that I don't think anybody's ever tried since, to downplay expectations to where it's almost daring you to buy the soft drink.
Right.
And I actually think it might have been successful if the soft drink was not really disgusting.
Disgusting tasting.
It was really gross. It was like non-caffeinated Mountain Dew with donkey urine mixed in. I remember when the art director, who had no interest in the product, he was just really into this campaign. And I remember asking him, like, is it going to be like cola or Sprite or what? And he was like, I don't think they figured that out yet. And I was like, well, what color is it going to be? And he's like, we're thinking orange. Like, just that's all like a marketing decision.
It's all marketing, no product.
I realized the other day I was going through a drawer and I realized I still had a full can of it, so we could like take it to
you could auction that
chemist
off.
and figure out what it was.
Yeah, you could do that as well. Yeah. Find out what's in it.
Yeah.
So okay, I also just reread Ghost World, and I have a very specific question about Ghost World, and this is kind of like,
I haven't read it in a long time, so I may be the wrong person to ask.
I know I know this is kind of like a Trekkie asking William Shatner.
I have a guy who's like does my bibliography and is a really careful reader of all my work. This guy named Ken Perill, and if I ever I'm writing a story and I think, did I use this scene in another story? I ask him because I have no idea.
You said you told a story once about forgetting the name of a character that someone was trying to impress you by. Right. Can you tell that story?
Well, I think it was at a Hollywood meeting when we were trying to get the Ghost World movie made, and he said, "Now who's going to play?" And I still can't remember the guy. I think it's Alan Weinstein. He's like, "Who's going to play Alan Weinstein?" And I was like, I don't know. And I was thinking, like, who the hell is that? I have no idea who that is. And then he kept referring to that, and I finally said, I don't know who that is. Yeah. And he was like, it's the guy where Enid loses her virginity. It's like one of the whole big stories. And I was like, oh, shit, Oh, yeah.
Right.
But he immediately was like, you're not getting our money,
Yeah. Well, this may be one
drugs.
Of the... Well, it's actually, I'm glad that you say that because I have the same experience. And then, so anyway, so if you have no idea what I'm talking about, so in Ghost World, there's somebody who's spray painting the word Ghost World.
Right.
And I was wondering if you know more about that than the reader does, or
well, the original source of that title was in the neighborhood I lived in Chicago, which was really a gang turf when I lived there. So there was all kinds of graffiti that would then be crossed out, and the other gang would, so any like blank space was covered with this kind of enormous, aggressive gang graffiti. And in the midst of that, I noticed one day on this garage, just covered with graffiti, somebody had written very small, just wrote Ghost World. And I thought, that's really a cool phrase. This was before Google. I would have gone home and looked it up to see if it referred to anything. But I kept asking people, is that like a band, an album, or a movie? Is that any? And nobody ever knew of it relating to anything, and it just stuck in my head. And that neighborhood I lived in felt very much like sort of the genesis of the Ghost World story. So and the other day I went to another event here at the book festival. I went to see a screening of this movie Fat City, where Leonard Gardner, the author of the book, was there, and he talked about how he wrote this book and he didn't have a title. And one day he was walking and saw graffiti that said Fat City, and he was like, "That's my title." And I thought that was really remarkable.
Well, with Ghost World, a lot of people, well, with all of your work, those of us who are reading it, we're reading all this stuff into it, and we think you're making these like incredible, grand, complex statements, and sometimes it's just something that you saw or that happened. Like one of the other things from Ghost World that I loved, that I thought was so brilliant on so many levels, was this woman calls out of her window what TV celebrities people walking by look like.
That was a real woman in my neighborhood in Chicago.
So when I first read that, I thought, oh my God, he's such a genius. This is commentary on our relationship with fictional characters and how we impose it on. And so, so she was the genius.
Well, it was just such a... she would brutally reduce everybody to their archetype, so it was really painful, and I can't remember. I think she called me Don Knotts.
No, Mark Harmon. She called you Mark Harmon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That was back when I had hair. But you'd see other people who were, just marginally looked, like some character, and she would brutally, you're Horseshack from, Welcome Back, Kotter, and so you're just like, oh, come on.
So these layers in your work that people are seeing, do you feel like
it's more like a documentary where I'm just, taking notes and editing.
Yeah, you're curating.
Yeah, curating. I mean, it's moments that to me have a sort of undefinable spark, some kind of something that has a depth that I can't quite analyze or don't want to analyze and take it apart. And I'm trying to, recapture that and put that in the work.
And then when you do recapture it, and then you're looking back at having done it, and you're listening to all these people trying to interpret it, and do you just think, oh, those are all interesting interpretations, or do you ever think, oh, this person saw something I didn't see? And
always, very, very often. It's people who read it carefully often have things to say that I think, oh my God, that's exactly what was working in the synapses of my brain that I wasn't aware of. They made this connection that I would have never ever, put into words.
So along those lines, someone in an Amazon review of Death Ray said that Andy, the protagonist, who develops superpowers or delusions of superpowers, but is the United States, and that his, quote, Italian fascist sidekick, Louis, represents Israel. And he did the entire review as an analysis of the U.S.-Israel relationship and on the world stage and the arms race.
I was that story was absolutely influenced by the post 9/11 events. I probably started working on that like the week of 9/11, like not just coincidentally. That was like right around when one of my comics came out, and so I was starting a new issue. So the entire time I was working on that book, I was listening to talk radio, and
so was
being
Graph
influenced by
Dog slightly correct in that it was at least about
Graph Dog?
that was
Oh wait,
his
that's
handle.
me.
Oh, by the way, he gave you 5 stars.
Oh well, I love the guy. One of the
Which
great
I thought was funny.
thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, he gave you 5 stars based on him believing that you were making a very anti-Israel, anti-U.S. Policy statement.
He took it farther than I certainly didn't have the Israel aspect of it.
No,
but
I
that's,
didn't even understand it, actually.
I'm going to actually reread it with that in mind.
Yeah. But
At least he's not like my other reviewers whose other reviews are all for baked beans.
Yeah, yes.
That's my favorite.
Yes. Yeah, that's, authors...
One book and 18 different varieties of baked bean.
When an author is unable to resist the lure of reading Amazon reviews...
Which they must. You must be steadfast in that.
But then when you're not, then you click on what else they've reviewed.
Right. And it's always comforting.
Yeah.
Oh. It's always like, it's like the Odyssey is a crap, or something.
Right.
My wife said there was a guy, she reads them, she loves to read them, and she said there was a guy who kept writing about how, what a sham my marriage was. And it was like, he's clearly unhappy in his marriage, and it's well known that, and she was like, where is he getting this? And I was like, believe me, I have no idea. It's made you wonder.
Oh my gosh. That's very funny. Okay.
The funniest one I ever read was on, it was on IMDb once. A guy wrote about what a jerk I was, and he said I saw him on the subway. I don't know what he looks like, but I know it was him because I looked and he was drawing, and I could recognize his drawing, and there was no doubt it was him. And I went over to him and asked, "Are you Dan Clowes?" And he said no. And so I thought, what a jerk! I think he's so cool, to like, that he doesn't want to talk to his fans. He's too cool. And I was thinking, like, I haven't been on the subway in 35 years. I get really bad motion sickness. I can't draw on anything. Anybody ever comes up to me, I'm like practically hugging them. I'm like, yeah. So I love the idea that like he went up to some random guy and then was like sat across from him stewing. What a jerk. Also, I want to meet that guy and hire him to, letter for me.
Yeah. So, I would like to talk about lettering.
Yeah, my favorite subject.
Oh, good.
Watch as the audience files.
Right. So you mentioned that the only art class you learned something in was a bit about
called display lettering.
Mm-hmm. And I love your lettering, and I'm wondering, what is it? I don't know. Just talk about lettering.
Well, I went through many majors in art school, and at one time I was a graphic design major, which always involves combining typography and some kind of visual. And back then it was pre-computer, so you wouldn't just have any font at your disposal to do what kind of thing you want. You would use these this stuff called letratone letters, where you would actually like rub them off with a little stick, and it would transfer the letters one by one to this piece of paper, and they were really expensive. And at a certain point, I was like, I can't afford more, Helvetica 12-point or what, you'd have to buy new lettering, and you'd wind up just using the same ones over and over because that's what you had lying around. So I thought, like, I got to just learn to draw whatever lettering I want. And so that's where it all began. And I did very crude versions of just Helvetica, things like that. And then I decided, I'm going to try more complicated stuff. And by the end of art school, I could do almost any font, sort of respectably. They weren't perfect, but, you could get across what they were.
There's something different about the hand, even when it's meticulous.
Yes.
There's something about hand-drawn lettering.
There is. And I try to make it look as perfect as possible, but you can never do that. And so there's always some little slight variance that lets you know it's done by hand. And even when people do fonts based on their own lettering and things like that, I can tell a mile away, because there's just certain spatial things that you would never do, that computers do. And so to me, it's like being punched in the face when I say, I really am sensitive to it. It would be like listening to people talk that have a slightly robotic tinge to their voice at all times. There's something off
like
about it.
Like when you call a voicemail system,
right?
You can tell it's a robot.
Yeah, it just to me, I'm very hypersensitive to that, and I try to make the lettering in the panels, in the word balloons. I try to do it really as quickly as I possibly can while still maintaining that look, so that it has the feel of, it's almost like the speed I do it is the speed they're speaking.
Mm-hmm. And you have to be, with this type of a format, you can't be too wordy.
No, there are certain rules. There are old, there's a famous French comic called Blake and Mortimer, and every single panel is a character standing like this, and there's a word balloon with like a paragraph, where it's like, back in 1865, blah, 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 Mm-hmm. And it really gives the impression that the character is standing there like this during a speech, just, just frozen in space. And it really, so you have to, make the beats of the word balloon work in conjunction with how fast the people are reading and what the drawings look like, so that it doesn't ever feel like they're just pontificating, unless that's what you want. Sometimes that's fun.
Okay, well, I think we should open it up for questions.
All right.
And I'm assuming, that you can shout out your question, and then I'll do that thing where I repeat it into the microphone. Anyone? Yes?
I'm curious. I got the impression from something you said that the story, one way would be to write it and then go back and fix it. But I'd be curious about the process of how it all comes together.
I've tried everything. I've tried, starting in the upper left-hand corner with the first panel and going that way with no idea what's going to be down there. That's often disastrous. And I've tried writing 50 versions of the story, meticulously figuring out every little thing, and that tends to sort of dissipate all your creative energy. So I've tried to find a balance between those two. But with comics, there's no real editing that you can do. There are certain things you can do, but you can't insert a panel. Everything's not fluid. The pages are designed to work a certain way. And it's, in a movie, you can insert a little scene. You can have a guy picking up a fork, and that explains why he's doing something else. But in a comic, you're really married to the flow of the story as you envision it. So it requires you, or for me anyway, to know in my head what's happening so clearly that I know all the variables and things before I start drawing.
Looking at the settings in your comics and trying to figure out, is this a certain place that I know?
It probably is.
And that's what I think. Sometimes I see a sign that's on East 14th or something, but it's also really anonymous, and you can't even figure out what kind of city it's supposed to be a lot of the time.
The idea is to not overly suggest a certain place. It was funny when I first did Ghost World, I had moved from really urban Chicago to Berkeley, up by the campus. And it's my first time in California, first time around palm trees, things like that. So the story is like the architecture of urban Chicago that I grew up in, brick apartment buildings and things like that. But all of a sudden there are strip mall signs that you only see in California, palm trees, just wide open spaces as though there's an ocean in the background, things like that. And so it was a weird hybrid of locations. And then at a certain point, people started saying, oh, you really captured suburbia. And I thought, I've never lived in the suburbs in my life. I don't have any clue what that's like at all. And yet somehow the combo of California plus Chicago equals suburbia, so it's, and people really would say wow, you must have spent a lot of time in Roanoke, Virginia, really specific, So I take that as a plus if everybody can kind of place themselves in it.
You may have noticed I'm not, in fact, reciting the questions back again. We're just diving back in.
If somebody can't hear, let us know.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, I have watched Ghost World with my kid many times, and both of us want to know, are you ever going to see Death X-Ray on the silver screen before I die?
Probably not. You're going to live out a sad existence. I wish, but it was something we worked on, and I wrote a script for it, and it went, a movie goes along that trajectory, and people were interested in it, and then once that kind of plays out, it's really hard to get it back again. It's much easier to just start with something new. People are newly excited, but once something has kind of played it out and gone the rounds, it takes another 15 years for it to be plausible again. So, you look like you could live another 30, 40 years, maybe more than I will.
It
might happen. My son will, greenlight it. Profiting off the old man.
I just want to mention that, of course, in addition to Ghost World, this fall, Dan's graphic novel Wilson, the film adaptation, will be released and in theaters this fall.
Yeah, we don't have a date yet.
Very exciting. Yes, sir?
This is also about setting, I guess, and one thing that jumped out at me in Patience was that the stuff in the early 2000s looks familiar to me. The 80s is very well observed. And then we have the section 2026, which is not that far away, and it's like insane, garish Star Trek land, which I love it, but I'm just curious, how much of that is just because it's fun to draw? How much is the character's point of view as someone who kind of doesn't want to move on? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, one of the main answers would be answer A. It was really fun to draw and fun to think about that kind of an opportunity. And I tried to imagine it as something that is plausible. I drew a very small section of the world. You just see a certain aspect of it, and I was trying to think, this might be a newly built section of town that you're seeing. So I tried to keep it in my mind as something that was plausible. But I don't know, the idea of drawing the future is always, you're always at the risk of disappointing everyone, because as a kid I would read books about the future and see movies about the future, and it was, then you would get there and you'd think, no, it's just everything's much more chaotic and messy and not at all streamlined. It's not at all an Apple computer vision of the future. It's much more just where everything is all over the map, and so I wanted to have a little hint of that, but I also wanted just the pleasure of being in this alien world of the future to take place.
Any more questions? Yes.
Oh, I was wondering if you have, movie, book, whatever it is, if you have kind of a dream collaborator or co-conspirator that you would work with.
Movies. There are many directors I would love to, sort of have just come in and do their version of it. I feel like in comics, I don't like collaborating. I don't even like to read other people's collaborations. I really feel like the beauty of comics is that it's this one singular vision transmitting their vision onto paper, and then the person who reads it is reading it by themselves, and it's a very intimate one-on-one relation. And I always wish when I'm reading the work of a writer that they had just drawn it themselves, even if they can't draw.
Well, okay, so this brings me to another question. Even though some of us are kind of old, should we start learning how to draw?
I find even the crudest drawings more interesting than somebody else kind of interpreting it. I don't know.
Also, on the topic of directors,
yeah,
what do you think about Wes Anderson as a director?
I feel like he's way too much his own thing. I don't think he's a collaborator. You know?
Yeah.
Like he's sort of like me with comics, where it's anybody else working with him, I think, would just be diluted into that vision.
Your favorite comics when you were a kid?
Favorite thing in the world was Mad Magazine. That was
Yeah.
All right. Well done. Yeah, I had a subscription, you know, from the time I was 8. I can still remember all the fake Mad movie titles, which really, really irritates people if you start going into it.
Can you think of any right now?
201 Minutes of a Space Idiocy. The classic one, of course, is A Croco Bleep Now. Like they actually wrote bleep on. Yes, sir. I was much more interested in drawing growing up. And even up through art school, I went to learn to draw comics. And I really didn't think of writing comics at that time. I was looking for you to come write. I was really like desperately looking for someone who could write for me. And I knew I lived in New York in the late 70s when I was in school, and I knew all these people who worked at or who went to NYU for fiction and things like that, and I would meet with people and say, "Oh, can you write comics?" And I realized that it's very difficult to write comics. It's a certain sensibility you kind of just have to have. You have to have read enough comics to sort of understand how to tell stories. And people who are engaged in writing prose tend to vastly overwrite their comics and paste them in a way that doesn't work. But also, I couldn't find anybody who was writing the kind of stories I wanted to draw. So sort of by default, I started writing my own stories. And to this day, I'm always thinking, oh, I wish I could find somebody to write these stories. But I know that's, I know the way I now work, which is always, doing my own thing. But it's the least fun part of the process for me. I usually start with an image, something that just has that, it gives you that itch that you can't quite reach, that's got that kind of spark of life to it. And it's often very mysterious, I think, why do I want to do that? And you get to that in the process of writing, you kind of figure that out.
And the original idea for Patience began as a magical little kernel like 20 years ago.
Yeah, it was about, 1995. It was going to be a little 4-page backup story in 8-ball. And I could never figure out how to make it work as a 4-page story. And then I realized it's because it's a 180-page story. Guess I got to have a really tiny panel.
I'm just wondering what you like to read that's not comics.
Not comics? What is this, a book festival? I realized recently that I'm one of those people who gets really excited about a book at like 6 o'clock at night. I really want to read this. And I get it out and I read, 80 pages before I go to bed. And then the next day I do that with a different book. So, I went through a big Nathaniel Hawthorne phase recently. I found the mood of those is so much more interesting than the horror writers who came after him, who were sort of inspired by him.
So what year are we talking? Hawthorne is what?
Hawthorne's 1830s,
1830s?
Yeah.
So on the House of Names website, you are actually listed as one of the most notable Clowes. Right after...
Doesn't take a lot.
Right after a...
William Clowes.
B. Valentine Clowes.
That's
was the
just
only one
made up on this.
Oh, a
That
politician
doesn't
from the 1880s. Okay,
No.
maybe not.
No.
Okay, let's.
I was wondering about the relationship between your sort of growing, recognition and celebrity over the course of
Very famous.
your career. For this genre, certainly, you're one of the more well-known people in it.
In the world.
The world, yeah.
I still have to pay full price at the comic store, even though they give professional discounts to everybody else. Oh. I mean, when I first began, my vision of fame would have been to get 5,000 readers. And that still seems incredible. Like, I'm one of those people who can't, if somebody says, like, I got paid $200 to do this, that seems like a lot of money. And if they say I got paid $500,000, that means nothing, because I can't conceive of it. So it's, I think, still in terms of, like my comics finally got up to the point where I had 30,000 readers for 8-Ball. And that seemed just mind-boggling, and it still does. I mean, that's just incredible that there were that many people who would make the trek to the back room of the comic store and find the adults-only box, and here it is, And so I can't really conceive of anything beyond that.
And by the way, so 8-Ball, which ran for about 15 years,
Yeah.
Was the genesis of a lot of these graphic novels that were serialized there and a lot of other wonderful work.
It's very complicated.
It's very complicated. And there's now a new boxed set out of 8-Ball that you can get that's the full collected 8-Ball. I don't know if Green Apple's going to have that as well, but it's a
must-have item.
Yeah. Yes, over there.
Ghost World and Are Still Confidential, the movies, seem to be very, very different from the story. I was wondering if there's any books
Well, I would say the Wilson movie that's coming out is the closest to the actual book of anything I've written or done. In a lot of cases, the books just don't quite work as movies. Ghost World would have made a good hour-long TV show or something. It just didn't have the full oomph for an entire 90-minute film, so we had to rethink it. And certainly Art School Confidential is a 4-page story, so we had to pad it out a little bit.
Anybody else?
In Ghost World, you really nail the, intense juvenile intimacy that happens between young women. And while you said that you base the characters off of a number of different people, I was wondering if there was a specific relationship that you had observed to kind of model that one after, or if it was just intuitive.
Well, there was. But I had two good friends in art school who were those girls very much, and I was very, very shy and quiet, and I was just sort of with them all the time, and they would just kind of forget I was there. And they would be that, and then they got comfortable around me. And so I felt like I was so astonished that, wow, they're just like me and my male friends. It was so shocking to me as an 18-year-old, and it felt like I had this sort of intimate experience where I got to sort of see this thing. And then I found that more and more as I got older and knew more. I was always just attracted to those type of women who are very, sort of outspoken and funny.
Hi, Stacy from City Lights.
So Dan, I work in publishing, so actually I wanted to ask you about your relationship with your publisher, your book publisher, because I think you've had the same one for a long time. And the way it sounded, it almost sounds like, okay, you do every part of the process, but you must have an editor in-house who you present the work to, like anyone would present their work to a book editor, and do they read it and say, Dan, this doesn't really make sense? Or how much do you have a back and forth process, and does that change the way that the...
I have a guy who corrects the typos, and that's really it. I don't get an advance before I finish a book. I'll finish it all completely on my own, and then I turn it in. And if I'm happy with it, that's how I want it published. And if somebody were to read it, or more, I let 4 or 5 people read it, certainly. And if they all had a similar feeling, this part is a little slow or something like that, I would absolutely go back and look at it. But for the most part, if I'm really content with what I did, I'd rather it just be published as is, and whatever you want to pay me for that is fine. So I have several publishers that I submit work to, and it's really on a basis of who I think is the most appropriate for it. And this book really felt like a Fantagraphics book, just in the context of other stuff they publish.
Let me ask a follow-up on that. Because you're doing something that almost nobody does, which is writes it and then decides whether or not you're going to let them publish it, and they haven't already.
And there's always the option of never publishing it, which I always feel that's a very comforting thought to me.
Yeah.
Until the very end. I often think I could just print my one copy, give it to my close friends, and then that would be it.
Yeah.
I would starve to death, but...
But because you do it that way, and do you still negotiate an advance, or do you just get a higher percentage of sales, or how do you do it?
Usually I get it. Even after you submit a book, it's another year or more before it actually comes out. So usually somebody will give me money when they agree to publish it.
Okay.
So it's sort of like an advance that didn't tide you over at all while you were working on the book, which is the whole point of an advance.
Do you feel like you do? Well, you must just be a lot more confident. You're like, it's not speculative. Here it is, and it's.
No, I'm not confident. I always feel like every book is the disaster, and this is going to be the one where they go, you know what? Might want to take this to the other guy. I always feel like somebody would publish it. I could find a publisher, but I never have any confidence about it till it exists in the world, and I see it as a book, and okay, that's a book.
And you see it compared to U.S.-Israel policy, and
that's right. Once it's
cemented. Who else? Yeah.
You might want to know that there is a copy of Boredom, the board game, that you did a really long time ago.
Yeah.
At Half Price Books for $300.
What? It's a steal. I'm guessing there are only like 30 of those in the world or something. I didn't make any. It was produced by a guy in Berkeley who had this great sense of economics, where he was like, he came up to me one day and he goes, "There's a huge demand for this. Everybody wants this game, so I can't do it anymore." And I was like, "That's how business works." That was when you're like, "I'm hiring new people." So I thought that was a great way to run a business.
What is he doing now? Yeah, that's so funny. Okay, who else? More questions?
In follow-up to your earlier answer, what are 1 or 2 of the movie directors you really would like to work with? Would you have?
Oh my God. Most of them have been dead since the 70s. Well, when I first started working on Wilson, I was originally writing it with Alexander Payne, director, and I always thought he'd be a good match. He and I got along very well. Obviously David Lynch would be good to do my Like a Velvet Glove story. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I never, it's you always feel like the director that would be the best for something is the guy you never thought of. The director that never occurred to you is probably the one that's appropriate for it. That would do the out of the blue strange film based on your work. I feel like a lot of directors I really admire have such a strong personality in their work that it would be their film more than mine.
And you wrote the screenplays for your films, which a lot of people don't get the chance to do that. What did you learn about the difference between a screenplay and a graphic novel?
Screenplay is a lot easier than a graphic novel. It made me lose respect for screenwriting. I mean, to write a really good screenplay is incredibly difficult, and you have to have a sense of how it works on screen, which is not something. It took me a long time to kind of figure that out. How dialogue. I can write dialogue that reads a certain way on the page, and it would get people attracted in the scripts I was writing, and then the minute an actor says the line, you realize, oh no, that's just, it reads well on a page. It's not something a human can articulate. There's a few lines in Ghost World that every time I see, I'm like, oh, poor Steve Buscemi, But you can do a lot with a screenplay that you can't do in a comic. You can mix things up, you can change things around. Everything is so malleable that it's kind of a relief to work on after working in the strict world of comics.
Another question?
For patients, did you do any research into time travel? I mean, both the science and the literature.
I ran from it. I tried to do no research whatsoever, especially not other works of fiction, and because I knew I would be influenced, if not imitating what I saw, I would be trying to, I can't be like that, so I have to I wanted to have my own naive vision of time travel without that baggage. And people kept telling me, there's all these movies you need to see that, and I couldn't wait. As I was working on the book, I was like, I can't wait to see Primer, I can't wait to see Looper, all these films. And now that I'm done with it, I have no interest anymore. I was like sort of burned out on it. But I do need to, eventually I'll see all these time travel films. But I wanted the science to be non-existent. I wanted there to, that to me was not interesting, because I don't want to make you read the book, have you read the book and think that's in any way what it's about.
More questions?
If there's no more questions, I think we can end it.
Give you plenty of time to get over to the
get in line to buy
the book signing Green Apple. I would like to thank Dan Clowes.
Thank you.
Thanks
for
so
coming.
much.